It began with something as ordinary as a grocery trip, the kind of errand people do without a second thought. But on that bright afternoon, the air inside the neighborhood store carried the weight of an unforgettable moment. The automatic doors slid open and shut with their usual rhythm, letting in the warmth of the sun as families, workers, and retirees moved through the aisles with their carts. It was the kind of place where faces were familiar, nods were exchanged, and routines rarely broke. But on this day, that sense of normalcy would be shattered, leaving behind a story that no one in that store would ever forget. Near the produce section, where the citrus fruits glistened under fluorescent lights, an elderly woman stood with her cart. Her silver hair was pinned neatly, her glasses perched low on her nose as she inspected a bag of apples with visible impatience. She muttered to herself, unaware that others nearby could hear her frustration. A few feet away, a young black man moved toward the oranges, balancing his basket in one hand and his phone in the other. His name was Marcus, tall, calm, and casual in a navy hoodie and worn jeans, just another shopper trying to get through his list before the evening came. He wasn't expecting anyone to notice him, let alone target him, but in an instant, everything changed. The woman turned and caught sight of him. Her expression hardened, her lips tightening as if she had stumbled upon something offensive just by his presence. Her voice cut through the hum of the store, sharp and pointed and far too loud to be mistaken as private. "You people don't belong here," she said, her tone laced with venom. Heads turned, shoppers froze. The hum of casual conversation fell into a tense silence. Then, as though she needed to make herself clearer, she added with an air of defiance, "Why don't you go back to Africa where you came from?" The words hung in the air like poison. A mother near the bread aisle pulled her child closer and hurried away. A man stacking bananas stopped mid-motion, his hand trembling slightly as he debated whether to intervene. An elderly man by the potatoes glanced nervously between Marcus and the woman, as though bracing himself for an explosion. But Marcus didn't explode. For a few long seconds he stood still, his basket handle tight in his grip, his phone forgotten in his hand. His brows furrowed, but he didn't let anger take over. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate breath and straightened his posture, letting silence work in his favor. The woman adjusted her cardigan, her chin lifting with pride, clearly expecting him to argue, maybe even yell. She seemed ready to feed off whatever confrontation came next. But when Marcus finally spoke, his voice was calm, measured, and steady enough to ripple through the uneasy crowd. "Ma'am," he began, his tone firm but respectful. "Do you even realize what you just said?" It wasn't an attack. It was a mirror, a chance for her to hear herself the way everyone else had. But the woman showed no hesitation, no regret. Her response came fast and sharp. "I said what I said. This is my country. People like you don't belong here." A collective gasp came from the crowd. Someone whispered, "Unbelievable," under their breath, while others shifted uncomfortably, pretending to browse the shelves but not daring to walk away. Everyone wanted to see what Marcus would do. His eyes stayed fixed on the woman, but not with hostility. There was something heavier there. Thought, calculation, restraint. After another deep breath, he set his basket carefully on the ground, the motion deliberate enough to draw every eye. His presence seemed to expand, filling the silence with a quiet authority. "You said I don't belong here," he said evenly, his voice low but powerful enough that even the cashiers craned there, next to listen. "But let me tell you something about where I come from." The woman shifted uncomfortably but kept her ground, her jaw clenched tight. Marcus's eyes softened, but his words carried a weight that pulled the entire room in. "My great-grandfather was born in Mississippi. He was a sharecropper, working land he never owned, breaking his back so his children might have a better life. His father, my great-great-grandfather, was kidnapped, chained, and sold like property. He was forced to build a country that didn't see him as human. And yet, here I stand." The murmurs in the store grew louder. A man who had been scrolling on his phone slipped it into his pocket, unwilling to miss a word. Marcus's tone didn't rise, but it carried the kind of strength that demanded silence. "My grandfather fought in World War II. He put on a uniform, carried a rifle, and risked his life for this country. When he came home, he wasn't treated as a hero. He wasn't even treated as equal. He couldn't eat at the same counters or drink from the same fountains, but he stayed because he believed this country could be better, even if it didn't believe in him." Every face was turned now. Shoppers stopped pretending to browse. The tension that had once felt like fear had transformed into something else: respect, empathy, reflection. "And my parents," Marcus continued, his voice softening but never losing strength, "they fought too. Not with guns, but with kindness. My mother's a teacher. She spent her whole life helping kids, no matter what they look like. My father's a mechanic, the kind of man who'd pull over on the highway to help a stranger, even if that stranger was you." His gaze never wavered, and for the first time, the woman faltered, her grip on the apples trembling slightly. "So when you say I don't belong here," Marcus finished, his voice heavy with both sadness and conviction, "you're wrong. My family's blood, sweat, and tears are in the soil of this country. I belong here as much as anyone, maybe even more." The silence that followed was unbearable. The elderly woman's face flushed red, her lips pressed tightly together as though she wanted to respond, but couldn't find the words. The crowd was frozen, every eye on Marcus, waiting to see what would happen next. "Do you think the woman deserved a second chance after saying something so cruel?" The silence stretched so long that the hum of the refrigerators and the soft beeping of the checkout scanners became deafening. For a moment, it seemed like no one in the store even dared to breathe. The elderly woman's eyes darted nervously, from Marcus to the small crowd that had gathered, as though searching for someone who might defend her words. But there were no allies, only witnesses. Witnesses who now stood caught between shock, reflection, and a growing sense of unity against the hate that had just been exposed. A man in a baseball cap, probably in his 50s, was the first to move. He took a slow step forward, adjusting his stance as though summoning courage. "He's right," the man said, his voice rough but steady. "We've got to be better than this." The words broke the tension like a crack of thunder. Suddenly, the spell of silence was lifted. A woman near the frozen food aisle, her hand resting on her cart, nodded slowly. "My dad fought in the war too," she said, her voice trembling. "He always told me the only color that mattered was the red on the flag." The murmurs spread, voices joining in agreement, a ripple of support swelling around Marcus. An employee at the checkout counter, no older than 20, called out from across the store, "I've never seen anyone handle something like that so gracefully. Thank you." Her words carried sincerity, echoing through the aisles like a blessing. People turned to each other, some nodding in affirmation, others exchanging quiet words about how wrong the woman had been. The elderly woman's shoulders stiffened as she clutched her apples tighter. Her lips parted, and for the first time her voice was quiet, almost unsure. I didn't mean," but she stopped herself, realizing her defense would sound hollow. The shame in her eyes flickered for just a moment, but it was enough for everyone to see. Marcus tilted his head slightly, his expression softening, though his voice remained firm. "It's not about what you meant," he told her, his tone measured calm. "It's about how it came across. Words matter. They always matter." A slow clap started near the deli counter. At first, it was just one man, his palms echoing against the tiled floor of the store. But then another joined in, then another, until the sound swelled into something undeniable. The applause wasn't raucous, but it was powerful. An acknowledgement, a collective agreement that what Marcus had said was not only necessary, but overdue. The elderly woman, her cheeks pale, gripped her cart and turned toward the exit. Her steps were quick but unsteady, her departure quiet compared to the eruption of unity that had replaced her words. She didn't apologize, but the fire in her defiance had dimmed, and though she wheeled her cart away, the moment remained etched in the room, a stain that could never be erased, and a lesson that could not be ignored. Marcus bent down and lifted his basket again, standing tall as the applause died down into a hush. A woman approached him, her hand resting gently on his shoulder. "Thank you," she whispered, her eyes glassy with emotion. "You said what needed to be said." Marcus gave her a faint smile, his voice warm. "Sometimes it's not about winning or losing," he murmured. "It's about making sure people hear the truth." The crowd slowly returned to their carts, but the atmosphere of the store had shifted. Conversations lingered in low voices. Some people walked with a new lightness in their steps, while others carried a heaviness in their expressions. Their thoughts turned inward. The entire store felt as though it had been part of something bigger than groceries and errands, something raw, real, and unforgettable. At the checkout line, the young cashier who had spoken earlier scanned Marcus's items, her hands slightly shaky. "What you said back there," she said softly, her voice low enough that only he could hear. "It meant a lot. People don't always stand up like that, especially not with so much grace." Marcus smiled at her, his expression calm but reassuring. "Sometimes grace is the only way to break through. Anger just builds walls." When he stepped outside, the sun was beginning to set, the sky painted with streaks of orange and violet. The long shadows stretched across the parking lot as Marcus walked to his car, but just before reaching it, he noticed something that gave him pause. A few rows away, the elderly woman sat in her own car, her hands gripping the steering wheel tightly. Her face was turned downward, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Marcus considered walking over, saying something more, but he stopped himself. Some lessons, he thought, take time to settle. He had already planted the seed. Later that evening, Marcus sat at the kitchen table with his father. The day's events spilled out of him, every detail from the woman's harsh words to the way the crowd had rallied. His father, A man of few words, listened with quiet intensity, his rough hands folded on the table. When Marcus finished, his father leaned back and nodded once. "You did the right thing, son," he said finally, his deep voice steady. "Not just for yourself, but for everyone who was watching. People like her might not change overnight, but you planted a seed, and sometimes that's all you can do. Plant the seed and let it grow." Those words lingered in Marcus's mind, heavier than anything else. He realized that while the encounter had been deeply uncomfortable, it had been necessary. Silence allows ignorance to spread, but speaking up, even with calmness and dignity, could challenge it, even dismantle it. Across town, the elderly woman sat at her dining table. Her dinner plate was untouched, the steam from her food long gone cold. Marcus's words replayed in her mind over and over again, cutting through the armor of her assumptions. She thought of her own grandchildren, of the world they were growing up in, of the stories they might one day tell. For the first time in years, she felt something new gnawing at her: doubt. The following days brought more than just routine back into the store. The story of what had happened spread quickly through the neighborhood. Shoppers who had witnessed the moment shared it with friends, family, and co-workers. Strangers talked about Marcus's calm but powerful stand. The story wasn't told as just an incident. It became a lesson, a point of reflection, a moment that sparked conversations about prejudice, dignity, and the kind of world people wanted to build for the next generation. Rehook. But as Marcus soon discovered, the moment in the grocery store was only the beginning. The ripple effect of that day would stretch farther than he ever imagined. If you were in Marcus's shoes, would you have confronted her or just walked away? The days turned into weeks, yet the memory of the grocery store incident refused to fade. For Marcus, it wasn't about the attention. He didn't post about it, didn't seek to make it viral, but the story found its way into the community. Anyway, neighbors whispered about it at barbershops, teachers used it as an example in classrooms, and church congregations retold it during Sunday fellowship. It became more than a confrontation between a young black man and an elderly woman. It became a mirror that forced people to examine themselves. For Marcus, life went on as usual. He went to work, spent time with his family, and tried not to let the weight of that moment consume him. But deep down, he carried it. His father's words, "Plant the seed and let it grow," echoed in his mind whenever he replayed the woman's face, the mixture of anger and something else he couldn't quite name. Shame, fear, regret, whatever it was, Marcus hoped it had lodged itself in her heart. Meanwhile, the woman herself couldn't escape what had happened. Alone in her quiet house, she sat by the window most evenings, staring out at the street while Marcus's voice echoed in her head. She thought of her late husband, a soldier who had once spoken about the brotherhood of men overseas, how the battlefield erased divisions. She thought of her grandchildren who played freely with classmates of every background. And she thought of her own words, the harsh, ugly ones she had hurled so easily at Marcus. Words she now realized had not only hurt him, but had exposed something deeply broken in herself. One morning, she surprised herself by attending a community meeting at the local library. She listened quietly as people discussed ways to bring neighbors together to address the subtle divides that lingered in the town. She didn't speak, but her presence was noticed. And as she sat there, silent and small in her chair, she thought of Marcus again, how his calmness had disarmed her, how his history had humbled her, and how his dignity had left her no room to fight back. A month later, fate intervened. Marcus was volunteering at a local charity drive, helping to distribute food boxes to families in need. The line stretched long, filled with faces of every race, age, and story. Marcus moved steadily, handing out boxes with a warm smile, exchanging words of encouragement. Then, in the middle of the line, he saw her. The elderly woman stood holding her ticket, her eyes lowered, her shoulders hunched as though the weight of the world pressed down on her. When she finally looked up and saw him, the air between them thickened instantly. Marcus froze, gripping the box in his hands while she swallowed hard, her lips parting but no words coming out. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, the noise of the crowd fading into the background. Finally, she stepped forward. Her voice trembled, quiet and frail, but steady enough to be heard. "I was wrong," she said. The words seemed to drain her, as though they cost her more than she could afford. "I don't know if you can ever forgive me, but I wanted you to know I'm sorry." The people near them turned their heads, the moment catching like wildfire. Marcus studied her face. The defiance was gone, replaced by something raw, vulnerable, and painfully human. For a moment, he said nothing, just let the silence breathe. Then, with a quiet exhale, he set the box gently into her hands. "Change starts here," he said softly. His words weren't dramatic, but they carried weight, a reminder that growth wasn't about instant transformation. redemption. It was about the willingness to face your mistakes and choose better. The woman's eyes filled with tears. She clutched the box, her lips trembling, and nodded. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was a step. And in that step, the crowd around them saw something rare, the possibility of change, even in the most unlikely of hearts. In the weeks that followed, she began volunteering too. Slowly, cautiously, she entered spaces where she once would have closed herself off. She brought baked goods to the community center, donated books to the library, and even attended a local youth program, sitting quietly in the back as kids of every background performed skits about unity. People noticed, and though not everyone forgave her right away, they respected the effort. Marcus, watching from a distance, realized something profound. Sometimes standing up wasn't just about silencing ignorance, it was about awakening someone to the possibility of change. His words had planted a seed, but it was her choice to water it. And though she might never undo the harm of her past, she was proving that even an old tree could still grow new branches. Mini Riho. But the most powerful moment came months later, when Marcus and the woman stood together in front of a crowd, and her next words left everyone stunned. It was at a town hall event organized by the local council. The theme was building bridges. Marcus had been invited to speak, his reputation as a voice of calm strength spreading far beyond the grocery store incident. He spoke of dignity, of history, of the power of grace in the face of hate. When he finished, the audience applauded, many on their feet. Then, to everyone's surprise, the elderly woman slowly rose from her seat. Her hands trembled as she clutched the microphone, her voice wavering but clear. "I was the one in that store," she admitted, her confession sending a ripple through the room. "I said words I can never take back. I hurt a man who deserved only respect, and I embarrassed myself in front of my neighbors. But that moment, it changed me, because he didn't answer my hate with hate. He answered it with truth, with history, with grace." The room was silent. Every face turned toward her. Tears glistened in her eyes as she continued. "I can't undo what I did, but I can choose what I do from here on, and I want to spend the rest of my days trying to make it right." The audience erupted into applause, not for the perfection of her transformation, but for the courage it took to admit her failure and her desire to grow. Marcus, standing nearby, nodded slowly, his heart heavy but hopeful. He knew this was what his father had meant. Plant the seed, let it grow. The lesson was clear. Dignity is not weakness, and silence is not strength. True courage lies in speaking with conviction, in confronting ignorance without becoming it, and in leaving room for others to change. Hate can divide, but truth, spoken with grace, can heal. So what do you think? Should the woman's apology be enough to forgive her, or does true forgiveness require more than words?